Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор энэ нэлээд алдартай болж байгаа 21-р зууны Төрийн албаны менежер гэж ном дөнгөж орчуулагдаж монгол хэл дээр гараад байна. За энэ ихэнх англи хэл дээр. За энэ бол менежментийн тухай, ялангуяа өнөөгийн маргаашийн менежментийн тухай, нийтийн засаглалын тухай, нийтийн төр засгийн манайхаар ярьдаг төрийн албаны менежментийн тухай гарсан сайхан ном байна. Энэ номын зохиогч мөн Сингапурын Юу их сургуулийн эрдэмтэн профессор ноён Zeger оролцож байна.
Zeger Сингапурын үндэсний их сургуулийн төрийн бодлогын сургуулийн дэд захирал. Zeger Амстердамын их сургуулийг улс төрийн шинжлэх ухааны магистр, мөн сургуулийг нийтийн удирдлагын ухааны докторийн зэрэгтэй төгсжээ. Тэрээр Нидерландын Лейдений их сургуульд профессор, Сингапурын үндэсний их сургуулийн Юугийн нэрмжит төрийн бодлогын сургуулийн дэд захирал, дэд профессороор ажилладаг. Zeger ном сонин сэтгүүлд 100 гаруй мэргэжлийн нийтлэл бичиж хэвлүүлжээ.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Mongolia.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations with the opening of the ceremony of Mongolian translation of your famous book.
Thanks so much. It's a big honor and a pleasure to be here.
Please, at the beginning, let's talk about why you have done this book.
Sure. I actually started this book because I've become so inspired over the years by the many public managers I've met and I've worked with in executive workshops, in teaching, research, consulting, because it is, in many countries, the public managers who try to improve the country, often in very tough circumstances, surrounded by political turbulence, very critical citizens, limited budgets, and so on. And one of the striking things I've discovered after traveling to many countries, working with public managers all over the world, is that the issues they face, the challenges they face, are very, very universal. So in this world today, we like to emphasize differences between people, between countries. But actually, whether you travel to Mongolia, China, Singapore, Finland, the Netherlands, France, the US, public managers generally face the same kind of issues, the same big 21st century trends they're trying to grapple with. And so I was inspired to write a book about them and for them, really.
Major, I saw your definition of that similarity under very interesting categories like uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity, and volatility, which, as you said, true for every country. So what makes that book different to address public management challenges under these four circumstances?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, you're alluding to the so-called VUCA world, which is nowadays a widely used management acronym to describe the operating environment of not just public but also private sector managers. It's not a term I came up with myself. I can't claim it, but I use it as a sort of premise or central framework to my book. Why I think this book is quite different from many other public management textbooks is that it again starts with defining the challenges, the real life challenges that public managers face, and then looks at how both scholarship, research evidence, as well as best practice evidence from a variety of countries can help and inspire public managers to better face the challenges of our time. Rather than, as most public management books do, saying, well, here's what we professors have to tell you. There'll be a chapter on accountability, ethics, one on political administrative relations, one on administrative law. And you'll just read this book and then you'll end up being a wiser person or a better public manager. I thought it would be much more interesting from a design perspective and a pedagogical perspective to do things the other way around.
Well, 2 points. You have been visiting almost so many countries, 50, Japan, Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, and there's a dozen others. And you have been giving a consultancy to private sector and the public sector in particular. So, and under these 4 sectors, if I may say, please tell us the most inspiring cases or most challenging cases you would specify, including all these countries, if one by one, if you go.
Sure. You know, I must say, coming from a fairly developed country, the Netherlands, and working mostly in recent years in another developed country, which is Singapore, I feel I'm sometimes met with a little bit of skepticism when I enter a developing country context. And I'm quite mindful not to be the sort of white man from the West telling others what to do, right? And giving them my definition of good governance. So first of all, I always try to listen and see what kind of local innovations and solutions people have come up with. And then try to sort of analyze and compare those practices and innovations with others and see if it can still add value. I mean, a couple of things come to mind, and I'm sure we'll come to the context of Mongolia later, specifically. Sure. Kenya is an interesting country. Kenya started the so-called Huduma centers. Huduma is Swahili for service, a couple of years ago. And they are essentially sort of one-stop shops, government service centers where citizens can go and apply for and register and get done around, I think, 38 different types of services or so. So it started out as a digitization effort to make it easier for citizens to get a new passport, for instance. And it was just one center to begin with. Now there's around 200 centers across the country, and they allow citizens to obtain many different government services and prescriptions.
Here, sorry, I just interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
Before we continue following that logic, Kenya recently was reported as one of the countries that the most benefiting from the smartphones.
Right.
Is it any connections?
That's actually a very good point. I don't know if there's a direct connection, but I'm sure there's a connection in terms of the sort of mindset that mobile banking, because that's what you're referring to, right? I think that's become very, very big in Africa. So essentially, citizens without a bank account being able to do business and to send each other money just by using phones. It's fantastic, right?
Generations to have a money outside of in the middle of nowhere and get money and you go.
Right.
Yeah, and certainly this one-stop service you talked about now, 200. That's fantastic. What else? What other countries?
I mean, maybe it would be interesting to talk about Mongolia.
Okay.
Since we're here, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, as you know much better than I do, the country's embarking on I think you could best say constitutional, so political reforms, as well as administrative reforms at the same time. And like many other countries that are very resource dependent, Brunei, formerly the Emirates, you know, Dubai, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Russia, where I've been many, many times. I think perhaps the most pressing challenge is to think about a life beyond oil, beyond coal, beyond gas, beyond natural resources, because those resources are finite. They will run out one day, but maybe more importantly so because of environmental concerns and global environmental pressures, regulations. it may soon be no longer profitable to build an economy around kind of natural resource extraction. The question then becomes, what's next?
after?
Tourism, finance, become an education hub for the region, how to sort of maximize or leverage the strategic, also geographical position and history in between China, Russia, and other important countries. So to me, and I'm not saying I have the answer to this, but that would be one of the biggest challenges over the next 10, 15 years for Mongolia.
You have been working with Mongolian officials, public, it's not only this book, but before you were coming to the country. What is major your take? What are difference? What makes difference this country? And what are to be improved?
Right. I think first of all, what I found encouraging is that across the public service, so junior civil servants, senior civil servants, but also MPs, members of parliament, the same sort of vocabulary around reform is being used. So I think that's a good sign, because that's what it starts with, right? You speak the same language when it comes to reform. I feel there's a sense of eagerness and urgency to really change a couple of things and improve a couple of things. At the same time, what you see is a huge sort of path dependency in terms of historical baggage, if you will, a certain administrative tradition, and I guess quite comparable in that sense to for instance, Kazakhstan, where I've done a lot of work, where you see, 25 years ago, independence from the Soviet Union, a lot of reform, a lot of externally inspired, but sometimes pressured and financed reform. UNDP, OECD, World Bank, IMF, all the sort of global governance players being involved. But at the same time, a main challenge being kind of getting loose or getting rid of those old structures that's been around for decades, sometimes centuries. And so making that transition is hard for any bureaucracy, but certainly if that's your history.
Here we try to give new names, restructuring, but still in the mind that is staying, It's 30 years is not that long term in change of mind and institution and the structure. Right. But nevertheless, change is happening. Do you see, if you compare it with Kazakhstan, any particular difference?
I think what Kazakhstan has done fairly well is really maximize their natural resource economy, and they've actually managed to become almost now a high middle income country from a fairly poor country in just 25 years. But they've had a very different type of leadership, less democratic, more authoritarian, if you will.
Here we discuss an issue, knowing what exactly you said, because the type of democracy, they probably will have ahead the time to solve many issues we have been already solved. But we still to go a lot, in particular in terms of better use of for public the natural resources.
Right.
A lot of things to learn, and how important is the public management quality for that transformation?
I would say the quality of public management and the quality of government is perhaps the most crucial competitive advantage a country can leverage. And, many people always talk about the market. The market is superior. It's all about economic growth and so on. But you cannot have sustained economic growth or private sector innovation without the proper fundamentals. And those fundamentals are a level playing field, regulation, policy stability, and a very competent, well-trained public service. So, those that say and that have said in the past, we can almost do away with government. We can just replace it with privatized entities or agencies. I think recent history has really proved them wrong, and certainly after the global financial crisis, I think many of us, and certainly many of the big global intellectuals, have kind of rediscovered the importance of a strong state and the importance of good governance.
No doubt. How can we solve the challenge we face? With every election, in particular, another political party comes, they're almost wiping out all our public offices at all levels, mostly, and they're putting new people, and every 4 years the same happening, and as a result, we cannot strengthening the institutions, public institutions.
Yeah.
How to address?
So the issue you're pointing at now, I believe, is the politicization of the public service, right? So the fact that most of the senior public managers are political appointees, and they get changed or rotated every couple of years. This may well be the most pressing challenge. Frankly, I'm not I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Mongolia in any way, but the risk of politicization of the public service is a lack of meritocracy in appointments, right? That's not to say, politicians are not able to appoint capable public servants, but you never know where nepotism and cronyism and giving favors, friends, family, political affiliations come in, right? Frankly, after spending about 7 years in Singapore, but being from a highly plural, democratic country myself, I was very skeptical about a more authoritarian regime such as Singapore being able to produce good governance and public welfare for its citizens. But my thinking has shifted. I've shifted quite a bit in recent years after traveling across Asia. And so I do think democracy in the end is probably the type of political system we all strive for. But it comes with its complications when it comes to policy effectiveness and good governance. And certainly if you're a young transitional democracy, it may take quite some time to get those things solved.
That's the whole issue. Because it takes time also, the other changes expect after that are also extended longer.
Right.
What would be the best solution on that to make it a bit faster? Is it an issue, special law for public service, not to change people after election, etc.? What the way of protection out of?
I think it's always two things. So legal protections, legislation, of course, it's very important, right? It's it's basically the fundament or the infrastructure that solidifies change and reform. But we also know that paper, as we say, can be very patient, right? And laws can also be paper tigers. So mindset change, and perhaps most importantly, implementation and enforcement of existing laws and new laws may be just as important.
Paper can be patient, and the laws?
Laws can be paper tigers.
Paper tigers.
Yes. Yeah. These may be poor translations of Dutch sayings, but I think you get the gist of it, right?
We say that there's a similarity of bureaucrats and flies.
Right.
Do you know this proverb?
No.
Why is that similarity? Because both can be killed with paper. That's what we say.
That's a good one. I'd never heard that before.
Another anecdote here.
I'll keep that in mind. Yeah.
So the paper issue. Adnaka, we need laws that's to be on paper, that everybody knows and everybody follows, right? On one side. Because you talked about the hangover of communist system. The guy who used to work in old system, they like the word state officer.
Sure.
And we call it Төрийн ажилтан or state worker.
Right.
Then that term was used 100 years ago in our Western countries, including probably yours. Then it became public officer.
Right.
Then later now in Canada, public service.
Right.
Why? How come? I mean, what triggered them to change those changes?
I think it has a lot to do with also the changing nature of the state, and what the state is. And frankly, you could argue many Western countries are decreasing importance or perhaps a decline in power of the central nation state due to things like not just decentralization, right, of agencies and services, but also outsourcing and privatization in recent decades. What we've seen as a result is more flexibility, more rotation within the public service, and probably a depreciation of things like job security and domain expertise. And interestingly, even though many developing countries may follow that same road in their reform trajectories, I'm not so sure that's always been a good thing. If you look at the decline in trust in government in many Western countries, and nowadays the whole discussion around fake news, what is the best evidence, the contestation of information, I think a lot of that actually has to do with senior public managers moving to different posts every 2 or 3 years. So they become process managers rather than policy content managers. And I don't believe you can maintain legitimacy and authority if you don't know your policy domain very, very well, much better than the average citizen, or as they say these days, taxi drivers. There are some people who say, well, taxi driver knows as much about health policy compared to some policy professional who's been with the ministry for a long period of time. I think that's just factually wrong, and I think we need to bring back some of that expertise to the public service, even at the level of senior public managers. They have to know their stuff in order to be respected.
Well, on the other side, with the first time when Mongolia started to see the vibrant private sector, you suddenly see people another opportunity. Then they go for better money, for better reward of what you do. They tend to go to public sector, or private sector.
Right.
On the one side. On the other side, state cannot compete with the large companies to compensate their employees. That means you cannot attract necessarily their talents. So what is the incentives? How to get it done?
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because I'm not entirely sure money or pay is always the key driver, even for talented graduates, and certainly for newer generations, right? Because there's a lot of research evidence from human resource management, public management, sociology, psychology, that shows that the so-called millennials and Gen Z, those in their 20s and 30s, are actually not so much motivated just by money alone, or by job security, or by high societal status. They are actually motivated by having the feeling that an employer actually invests in them, lifelong learning, getting opportunities for training, getting funding for training, and actually getting a lot of responsibility at a young age. So being able to run exciting projects, even at a junior level, and directly seeing the impact of their work, that's actually a much bigger motivator for them than salary alone. So the question then becomes, do you really want to compete over compensation with the private sector? Because how do you know that will bring in the right types of individuals?
Still on the other side, Singapore, where you spent time, mostly a lot of years, you have been working with this Lee Kuan Yew University. Now you are the assistant dean research of that.
Not anymore.
I see.
Fortunately, I have time again to write books now.
Okay. Again, the level of minister salary in Singapore is comparable with the major 3 top private corporation in that industry sector. comparable.
Yeah.
Still, and down the road, down to the structure, maybe also to a certain degree. I understand, of course, the incentive is not money or pay, but however, you take gender picture, that cannot be paid 10 times less.
Great example, and I must say, my thinking about this has also shifted over time as a result of spending a lot of time in Singapore. I often do advocate, for instance, when I'm back in the Netherlands, that salaries for top-level public managers or politicians should be higher. In some of the Western countries, some of the developing countries. Simply not just to attract and recruit talent, because I think starting salaries or salaries up to a certain point are quite competitive. And there's these other drivers we just talked about. But mostly to retain very top talent at a more senior level. Because of course it's very hard for them to turn down jobs which may pay 2, 3, 4 times as much, right? However, I also find that the top salaries in Singapore are rather extreme. So a permanent secretary in Singapore could make around 10 times the salary of his or her counterpart in the Netherlands. And these are countries that are fairly comparable in terms of government performance, their global ranking, per capita GDP, and so on. So, does the performance merit maybe 3 times as much, but does it merit 10 times as much? So these high salaries are even in Singapore today not uncontested. There's a lot of debate about should they really be that high and so on. But maybe to get back to your central point, I do feel that sometimes the sort of intrinsic motivation of public officials, they're all doing it for the greater good, is misused to freeze their salaries or keep their salaries at a low level. So I think that's not entirely fair. I also think, the Singapore model is underpinned by 2 key arguments. The first one is we're a small competitive country. We're a unique country with a unique type of government. We need the best and brightest in our public service, so we need to pay very handsome salaries. But the second argument has to do with integrity and corruption. That's a very different argument, but also interesting, certainly in Singapore's region. That is, if you pay very handsome salaries, top officials will not be tempted to find additional sources of income.
Singapore can afford it. Here in Mongolia, we cannot afford.
Many countries cannot.
And also because not very clear transparency of political party financing here, there is a bigger chance for people to come to a public system, administrative system with the money.
Right.
They come, they directly or indirectly, and as a result, they serve, the whole government is serving, in particular in the post-communist countries. Government is serving now mostly the people with the money. It's not only Mongolia, but in general phenomena. You see any outcome? How can we solve the issue?
This is one of those, it's an immensely complex problem, right? And so suggesting there would be an easy solution would not do justice to me being a good academic, I would say. But this is a global phenomenon. If you look at the US, it's considered to be a fairly developed country. It's the world's #1 economy. Politics is hugely corrupted and captured by special interests. Not just big corporations, but even individual donors, billionaires, who have a lot of influence on policy. So that's a big issue. I think a couple of things. There's laws on party financing. And again, the US shows how difficult it is, even in a country with, I would say, pretty great legal tradition to address those issues. But that's what it starts with, right? So foreign streams of political party income, but also domestic streams. Is there a cap? Is it transparent? Is it being monitored? Is there, even if there is no cap, is there naming and shaming going on, right? Do people actually know who funds these parties? But then to go back to our previous discussion, I do feel that if countries, let's say like Mongolia, who do not have the type of budget surpluses Singapore has, could still probably earn back by making their public services more efficient and effective, and perhaps employ fewer people, and then paying the high quality people that remain higher salaries.
Yeah.
Not just at the top level, by the way. I think the lower levels are more important. If you want a big bang for your buck, pay lower and mid-ranked officials more, so they're not tempted to go out and seek bribes simply to provide for their family.
In the Netherlands, where you have been working also in the same field, you were also a public officer, right?
That's right.
How does this incentive system work? Is average public officer in the Netherlands confident that they will have not enough, but a decent income to cover their cost in life and their families?
Well, and I must say my stint in public service was relatively short before I moved into academia. But of course I interact with public servants all the time. I would say they're reasonably well paid. They're certainly not highly paid. It is also one of the reasons why many public servants in the Netherlands find consulting jobs when they become more senior and then have to be hired back, sometimes even directly by their former government departments at 2 or 3 times the salary. What is enough, right? When is enough enough? In the Netherlands, we've embarked on a pretty controversial law a number of years ago that caps all the salaries in the public and the semi-public sector. So that includes hospitals, housing corporations, universities, to the level of the of the prime minister. With the argument being the prime minister has the most responsible job of all and the hardest job of all, so nobody should be able to earn more than the prime minister. I don't know whether that was a good decision, because the prime minister, the position of prime minister is a political position. And so you're actually applying a political norm to a huge apparatus. We're talking about more than 1 million employees, you know, including hospitals and so on, where let's say the top-notch surgeon of the country, the best engineer, the best lawyer, the best infrastructure specialist, sometimes may have to be paid quite handsomely to make sure they don't run off to the private sector. And so I think...
But nevertheless, their income is not to be more than the prime minister income.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is there was a commission, famous commission, or committee I should say probably, that suggested in 2004 that all the salaries across the public, semi-public sector should be capped at the prime minister's salary, but only after that salary would be raised by 30%. Now that raise never took place, but the cap was implemented a few years later.
Very interesting. I don't recall any other countries like this. Do you?
I don't think so. But I think there is a general sense, and like I said, that's sometimes being misused, frankly, that, you know, since you're serving the public, you're promoting public interests, pay is not your key motivator, and thus you don't have to be paid that well, because there's other rewards and incentives.
Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, when he was playing that role which made him into the presidency, he was saying in his words, how about the teachers are paid like prime minister are paid like a teacher. That was his sentence, which brought, I think, a lot of thoughts to voters.
Right.
And they suddenly supported that actor so much that he became president.
But it sounds great and very humble and kind of like servant leadership. But we should not underestimate or neglect the fact that many political leaders are already independently wealthy, or they have no worries about money anymore. I mean, even look at the US, former Prime Minister of Australia, you have essentially multimillionaires coming into office and then say, oh, the salary is fine, or Trump's even saying, I don't accept the salary. I work for $1 a year, but he's worth $4 billion.
Yes.
So I think we have to have a fair discussion. We have to take those
maybe it's
things
better
into
to
account.
have a prime minister, probably the country richest guy to be prime minister.
Because they won't be beholden to any interests
That's
anymore.
another clear concept. At least it's clear that the rich guy is not coming. There's some of the wealthy guys are coming and they're saying that already in Mongolia. I'm not coming to this position to. I recall one of the rich one of the rich businessmen became prime minister in Mongolia, and I think that attempt was less than if compared with other scandals you will see during other presidency, the prime ministership. Last questions on how you can maintain all this works. You have got so many awards, you wrote so many books, you have been living in all these countries and traveling. What is the secret? What keeps you doing that all?
It is hard sometimes and to combine many responsibilities, personal, professional, living on the airplane from time to time. But I have a great drive. I believe what I do is sometimes, and I should be very modest about it, is sometimes important to people. And things like today, this morning's launch, it's very well attended, many senior officials, and having my book translated in another language, I think is testament to that. I mean, it's one way of being able to make some impact. And that really motivates me.
And your job is not only impacting on one government, on many governments, including Mongolian government. And on the other side, it also shows the commonalities of public management.
Right.
It's a certain group of a certain country elects the power, who is doing the public administration jobs for the sake of the people, right?
Right.
And in particular, when the 21st century, when all this we cope it with this artificial intelligence and all this technology revolution stuff.
Yeah.
Probably we are on the road where we'll have a less maybe in terms of people, but high in terms of quality services, right?
Yeah.
So the last point, what you would tell to Mongolian public officers having all these problems we talked, what the principles they should have in mind?
Sure. And that also allows me to go back to where we started with, which is the book, right? I believe, I'm a big believer in the concept of lifelong learning, and not just as a rhetorical concept, right? Because we may say it all the time, and then we find out governments don't really have any budget to send their officials on training and so on. But I do feel some of these big trends, for instance, being able to work with social media, big data, artificial intelligence, a largely digital government 10 to 20 years from now in any country, with very critical stakeholders who are used to online services from companies, from governments. It really requires public servants to think out from the perspective of the end user rather than their own perspective. So really think about what is the public value that needs to be created here? How can we make citizens happier, make their life easier, provide better services, rather than thinking about, our own procedures, our own difficulties, our own laws.
I'd like to finish this interview from your book, chapter 2 at the beginning. For things to remain the same, everything must be changed. Everything must change. Tancredi Falconeri, 1963. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
За, хүнд үзэгчдээ өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор энэ сайхан ном монгол хэлээр гарсан байгаа. Энэ номны зохиолч Zeger der Wahl гэж хуурцлаа. Манай нийтийн засаглал гэж ярьдаг. Бид бас төрийн алба гэж ярьдаг. Энэ хүмүүсийн амьдралд, та бидний амьдралд иргэнэлөө үзүүлнэ гэж итгэж байна. Баярлалаа.